Hello. So we'll start the class in a few minutes. We'll start at exactly 10:30 Alberta time. Okay, the lecture is actually about transphobia. So when I send you the slides, I don't know why. Let me stop. Well, we have a few minutes. For some reason, because of, maybe if I increase the screen. No, it still does that. Okay, I'll stop it and fix it. So I'm going to talk about the Brim textbook. And in this chapter, Brim discusses gender and the gender pay equity gap in Canada in detail. And so I'm going to discuss Brim's writing and findings regarding the gender pay equity gap, but I'm also going to talk about transphobia and Bill C-16, which is federal legislation which adds gender identity and gender expression to Canadian laws as a protected identity. So one cannot discriminate against transgender people and non-binary people in Canada legally, and if one is found to discriminate against transgender people or non-binary people because of their chosen gender identity and expression, they can face criminal charges or civil litigation, and their right to do business can also be called into question. So I'll discuss transphobia then, and I'll talk also about the gender pay equity gap and Robert Brim's writings about gender and sexism as in the book. And I'll cite from the Brim textbook Sociology and also other sources. So Bill C-16 is the Canadian law that protects people from discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression. It also protects against hate crimes and hate propaganda, and the law was passed in 2017. So how does Bill C-16 protect people? It adds gender identity or expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act. It extends protection against hate propaganda to groups of people distinguished by gender identity or expression. It makes it an aggravating circumstance when a court imposes a sentence if the offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate-based or gender identity or expression. How does Bill C-16 apply? The law applies to federal jurisdiction, including the federal government, First Nations governments, and federally regulated employers. How can I be respectful of gender identity? Use they pronoun. Use they if you don't know which pronoun to use. So it is good practice now, as I've discussed, I think in previous lectures, to use they if you don't know which pronoun to use. And it still sometimes is something people forget, but we can try to remember the law was passed in 2017. Simply use a person's name. Ask a person how they wish to be addressed. Refusing to identify a person by the pronoun that matches their gender identity could be considered discriminatory. So it is good to err on the side of caution, just for the sake of politeness as well, and in relation to law. So, Brim states that in general, more gender equality exists in rich than in poor countries. The top ranked countries are all rich, suggesting that gender equality is a function of economic development. However, my analysis data suggests that political factors are important too. For example, in some of the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, gender equality is higher than one would expect, given their level of economic development. Meanwhile, in some Muslim majority countries, gender inequality is lower than one would expect, given their level of economic development. These anomalies exist because the former communist countries tend to make gender equality a matter of public policies, where many Muslim majority countries discriminate against women in the public sphere. So Brim suggests that the Gender Inequality Index figures suggest that Canadian women still have a considerable way to go before they achieve equality with men. We have also seen that the gender gap in earnings is shrinking, but will not disappear until 2089, and then only if it continues to diminish at the same rate as it did from 1967 to 2011. That is a big if, because progress is never automatic. So Rim discusses the ways that gender socialization affects our capacity to perform in education and also affects our treatment of each other and the economy as well. Socializing children at home and in school to understand that women and men are equally adept at all jobs is important in motivating them to excel in non-traditional fields. Hiring more women to compensate for past discrimination in hiring, firing, promotion, and training is also important. However, without in any way minimizing the need for such initiatives, we should recognize that their impact will be muted if women continue to undertake disproportionate domestic responsibilities and if occupations with a higher concentration of women continue to be undervalued in monetary terms. So, Kettle Slagstad has written about gender and transgender rights. So, physician historian Kettle Slagstad uses the Scandinavian story of sex reassignment to anchor not only the role of the state, but also bureaucracy and social rights. Scandinavian countries, he shows, played a foundational role in the emergence of trans medicine internationally. So Slagstad writes, in our current cultural moment, discussions about whether sex and gender are spectrums or dichotomies have taken center stage. Defenders of transgender rights are often accused of pushing identity politics or gender ideology. However, Slagstad states the current situation has not appeared out of the blue. Attempts to define sex and gender have been a recurrent theme in medical history, and because the topic of transgender rights is necessarily also a medical one, this legacy underpins the current debates. A greater awareness of this history can help doctors become more responsible, empathetic, and reflective when we meet with transgender and gender nonconforming patients. Sykes states that a milestone in transgender history occurred in 2019 when the World Health Organization removed gender identity disorder from the chapter on mental illnesses in the International Classification of Diseases and replaced it with a new diagnosis of gender incongruence in a new chapter on sexual health. Transgender people were thus no longer labeled mentally ill, and trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming identities were recognized as expressing human variation. Repeatedly throughout the history of Western thought, nature has provided a rich resource for shaping norms, settling categories, and stabilizing concepts of normality. What counts as natural and what role nature plays in the order of things, however, are historically contingent. In the center of the medieval and Renaissance concept of nature, for instance, stood the goddess Natura, who protected heterosexual sex and continuation of the human species. In the history of medicine, the common has often been equated with the normal. In the past 150 years, we've seen how diagnostic and classificatory systems have pathologized and stigmatized people whose bodies, identities, or desires did not fit social norms. However, history also provides examples of doctors listening to the needs of trans and intersex patients and using medical knowledge to provide empathetic care. By shaping and guiding the concept of sex, doctors have enabled some bodies and ways of living while also invalidating others. Ultimately, the medical categories of homosexuality, intersex, and transsexualism have shaped contemporary understandings of sex. The history of medicine offers an antidote to the notion that we are simply looking at nature when we see sex and gender. What counts as sex and gender is historically changeable, morally infused, and politically loaded. So, as a physician and a historian, Kettle Slagstead is interested in the ways that the idea of the natural is obviously not a medical term. That a medical doctor would think about health and unhealth. They would think about sustainability and use rather than just the natural. So, for example, if one does not do any physical fitness throughout the whole course of their lives, they could have a heart attack and die. If you, I guess, didn't eat, you just didn't eat anything. I mean, you have a natural body, but you must do things with the body. You have to kind of use the body. You have to enact a set of gestures every day. You have to kind of live in the actual body to stay alive. And so just nature itself and the existence of, say, something does not mean that it sustains itself. One has to actually do things, and people have to use language and signs and symbols and objects in order to live in the body. So sex and gender is historically changeable, morally infused, and politically loaded. The way that people eat, the way that people live is obviously is something that changes over time, over context, and because of capitalism. And so medicine itself kind of changes this moral language of the natural. Feminists, writes Lola Olufemi, have rightly been concerned with the process of sex assignment. They recognize that throughout history, to be female has often meant death, mutilation, and oppression. Sex categorization has been the starting point for well-known feminist theories. But the idea of sex as immutable became a focal point of radical lesbian feminism in the West, and more specifically America, during the 70s and 80s. This was not the case across the board, especially among Black feminists, but there were many notable instances of feminist organizing that were hostile towards trans women during this time. So Olufemi has written a book that is critical of neoliberal feminism. And Lola Olufemi argues that the feminist movement really became co-opted by capitalist interests and neoliberal interests. And the book is called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And in the book, Lola Olufemi argues that transphobia among feminists and transphobia within the feminist movement was really a byproduct of capitalist interests. That when you kind of have a social movement, say you have a social movement of people who are working class, and we all call ourselves working class, we say we are working class. If there are people who are kind of more privileged, then then those people might get more attention in the media, and they might have a chance to make more money. They might actually have a chance to advance. They might be people who could run for political office and win because they are, say, more privileged members of our group. And so this is the same with the feminist movement. The mainstreaming of feminism within media, within institutions, the use of, say, girl power branding or the use of the feminist movement to sell things obviously creates a context in which the most privileged women, and specifically cisgender, heterosexual, white, middle class Christian women, can obviously brand themselves and use the language of feminism to make money. The problem is that transphobia emerges and TERFs, who are exclusionary feminists and transphobic feminists, emerge in institutions like the school system, the media, celebrity TERFs emerge. And this is how a group is splintered along class lines. So performativity is a concept that is discussed by contemporary authors who are interested in gender. And in talking about gender discrimination in the labor force, it is also important to question what gender is. And so when we discriminate against people, we already kind of believe in the existence of identity itself as a stable referent. And performativity is a concept from Judith Butler, who argues that gender is not innate or pre-given. Gender is performative. Gender is something that is constructed through a whole series of repetitive norms and a whole series of linguistic norms. So Judith Butler draws on an essay by J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words. And Butler is interested in what Austin discusses in the essay is that language is performative. Language is not simply just description. And language isn't just about kind of pointing and saying things like apple or orange. Like if you teach someone, say a child, a language, then they can point at things and say like apple or orange. But language for an adult or language over time, as you learn the whole language, becomes performative. So you would say, I want an apple or I want an orange, or you would think I'm going to go buy apples and oranges, and you would actually do these things. So language is not just a reflection of something that exists, it actually puts things into action. And it is also political in nature. So you might say, I only want to buy organic apples and I only want to buy organic oranges. So I'm only going to buy these organic products from this organic store, and therefore I'm going to support this industry, and I'm going to perhaps use my social and financial capital to create more and more organic apple and orange stores and restaurants and grocery stores. And this could mean that other industries are not open in a neighborhood I live in or even in a city. And so this is how language itself becomes about a series of performatives that are political in nature. And this is also true of gender. Sex is gender, and the way we think about both is entirely social. If one group of people consistently behave, speak, move, present themselves in one way and another in the opposite way, we reaffirm the idea that there is actually an inherent difference between those two groups when no such difference exists. While male and female bodies may have different physical capabilities in particular contexts, these differences in regards to testosterone and estrogen are not exaggerated. There is also a whole range of variations across members of the opposite sex. Many women are physically stronger than men. Many men are physically weaker than women. These are not exceptions that defy a rule. There simply is no rule. Biological differences are often exaggerated to explain phenomena that are entirely unconnected. Personally, social, and political interests, cognitive ability. To argue that there is a clear difference between sex and gender serves to solidify the idea that biological sex, prior to human beings inventing it and naming its tenets, exists. So, what is disputed in theories of performativity and in Judith Butler's writings is the existence of a male or female identity before the enactment of gender identity as a set of performatives. So when the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy when a child is born, obviously there is the existence of male or female genitalia. But this kind of obsession with gender as a way of organizing one's entire life, labor, self-esteem, the desire to live itself, is perhaps questionable. And it is questioned by Judith Butler's writings on performativity and obviously by the entire queer and feminist and transgender movement. To say that gender and sex are social constructions is not to say that they are unimportant or that gender is as simple as putting on a different hat each day. Butler is often misquoted as claiming gender is a performance, when instead she argues it might be better to view it as a ritual that is made up of certain kinds of repetitive behaviors that sediment over time. When we repeat this behavior, we create ourselves. Because of the way it organizes our lives, gender has life or death consequences. Consider the way that anyone who does not conform to ideas of their assigned sex is heavily policed. So transphobia does a significant amount of harm to people throughout the world, and sometimes the harm is a grievous bodily violence. It could be murder. The harm is really varied, but in its most extreme, the harm could be murder. Transphobia and murder. So in the Americas, 80% of the trans women killed as a result of gender violence are 35 years of age or younger. So what is striking or shocking and extremely disturbing from the perspective of human rights about the statistics is the youth and the age, that the majority of people who are transgender who are killed and dead in the Americas are very young people. And they are often killed by people who are also statistically young, or who the United Nations would deem to be young. And the UN often uses the number 35 to discuss who is young and who is old. Although this obviously depends upon life expectancy in certain places. But in the Americas, someone who is under 35 is deemed to be young. Understanding that there is nothing natural or stable about human biology helps us dismantle the idea that women's oppression is rooted in a singular place. We can believe that sex and gender are made up categories, embellished by social attitudes, and recognize that the violence that occurs as a result of them is very real. And so I'm quoting here from Lola Olufemi's book, Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And I can actually put this on the course website as a recommended reading that might be of interest to you, particularly if you're interested in graduate school. It is the violence that defines our experience of the world, not our biological makeup, that we often know little about. That Not our biological makeup, that we often know little about it. How often do you think about your chromosomes? So we often are not aware of our scientific or biological makeup unless we get very sick. But on an everyday basis, we are aware of how people's behavior towards us is often determined by the surface appearance of our bodies. And gender is one of the most kind of obvious and most extreme sets of ideas in the ways that often determine how people treat others. Often being perceived as a woman or failing to do womanhood correctly is enough to put somebody at risk of harm. Colonialism is one of the ways that gender has always been organized, or colonialism as a set of ideas and as a set of processes that involved expanding European capitalism and European governance throughout the world, also organized entire societies into gender binaries that corresponded to a European cisgender heterosexual family model. So I'll move ahead and discuss TERFs in the interest of time. So TERFs have been in the media a great deal, and TERFs are often transphobic people, and specifically transphobic women have been in the media a great deal, but there are lots of transphobic people who are referred to as TERFs. So TERF is an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. First recorded in 2008, the term TERF was originally used to distinguish transgender inclusive feminists from a group of radical feminists who reject the position that trans women are women, reject the inclusion of trans women in women's spaces, and oppose transgender rights laws. Trans-inclusive feminists assert that these ideas and positions are transphobic and discriminatory towards transgender people. So there have been lots of political debates involving celebrities, involving schools, about TERFs and about transphobia. The use of the term TERF has since broadened to include reference to people with trans-exclusionary views who are not necessarily involved with feminism. So in the 2020s, the term trans-exclusionary radical feminism is used synonymously with or overlaps with gender-critical feminism. Though TERF was created to be a deliberately technically neutral description, the term is now often considered a pejorative, derogatory, or disparaging, but may also be used as a self-description. The term has been widely adopted in the university system. People labeled TERFs often reject the label, instead describing their beliefs as gender critical. The opposition to the term has been described as leaning itself on a politics of injury that distances itself from the impacts of the ideology itself. So the term TERF has been used to discuss feminists but also other people who are unwilling to recognize trans women within the feminist movement. But TERF has always also been broadened to just been to discuss people who are unwilling to or cannot work with transgender people or cannot accept or include transgender people in institutions, even on the internet. And so in Canada, Bill C-16 makes it against the law to use this kind of transphobic language or exclusionary ideology, an exclusionary set of ideas to discriminate against people because of their chosen gender identity and gender expression. But in other contexts, and particularly in the United States of America, transphobia is often rampant, and I would argue that transphobia is a human rights violation um, that calls into question a lot of countries' capacity to follow international law. So when citizens, say in the United States of America, elect a government, they can elect a government because of their policies. They can elect a government because of the branding of a political party like the Trump administration. But they cannot enact violence against a minority population to the point that they violate international laws. So there are lots of debates now between Republicans and Democrats regarding transgender rights and regarding specifically healthcare, gender affirming healthcare for transgender people. The United States of America is not its own world. International laws exist, so the United States of America, like any other place, any religious village, anywhere in the world, any kind of park or any place where people try to live must follow international laws, or they can be subject to sanctions. So they have passed many bills because of the Trump administration against transgender and queer rights. And so it will be interesting to see what happens, and I'm sure there will be lots of lawsuits ahead. While many young feminists espouse TERF ideology, the public face of TERF organizing is often older, liberal, white, and middle-class women who vocalize concerns about the inclusion of trans women in feminist spaces and women's rights discourse, lamenting the generational divides in feminist thinking. They view the changing nature of language to describe gender and sexuality as a threat to feminist advancement, tending to be dismissive of newer kinds of feminist practice that take a radically materialist and intersectional approach as their starting point. So there is a moral panic, and moral panics are often used to kind of generate or to use a really emotional language about things that are often legal, and scientific. So a moral panic often introduces religiosity into a whole series of debates that are really about science and the law. So a moral panic is a period of widespread fear and concern over a perceived threat to society. It's often fueled by media coverage and can lead to long-standing cultural changes. So there have been lots of moral panics in the United States of America and throughout the global north in Christian societies. I mean, rock and roll music was a moral panic. Mini skirts were moral panics. I mean, having skin that's not white is a moral panic, and so the existence of transgender people is another moral panic. So what TERFs miss is their attempt to manufacture a moral panic about transgender people is that feminist thinking enables cis women to despise the social consequences of the sex we are assigned at birth and still comfortably occupy a gender that corresponds with it. To assume individuals transition flippantly suggests that medical transition is an easily available, unnecessary luxury, when in reality it can often be one of the only routes to safety for trans people whose bodies have been deemed unruly by society. So, under the guise of protecting women, TERF movements seek to reestablish strict gender codes. Whether through policing public bathrooms or making access to medical transition harder than it should be, they align themselves with the church and the state, who are not natural allies to feminists, in order to legitimize their agenda. By reoccupying the role of victim, cisgender women are able to frame themselves as the recipients of a kind of onslaught from a group of people making less than 1% of the population. So what often happens too in moral panics is anyone who has a problem, including anyone who has a problem working for a living, making money, just with their life in general, will kind of seize upon this group of people who is deemed to be moral and take out all their frustrations against them in ways that are really unfair and untrue and involve just kind of the laments of a really privileged, often older class of people who cannot manage money or refuses to work properly. Concerns of female erasure are central to TERF arguments, but what is most frightening is the way that they have successfully merged transphobia and right-wing rhetoric about threats to freedom of speech and the sensitivity of younger generations, turning the younger generation's practice of feminism that refuses to portray trans women into the result of political correctness. So the racial issues are also really clear in terms of who would be a TERF. They tend to be white women, and yes, older white Christian women who feel as though their jobs are being threatened or feel as though someone is going to usurp their capacity to make money because they cannot compete or don't want to compete. And they're the same often groups of women who didn't like or don't like or are kind of actively hostile towards women of color and Indigenous women. And it really does express this kind of almost fascist desire to stop people from competing to be very successful who are not white Christians. Another popular TERF argument is that instead of challenging the gender binary, transitioning merely reaffirms it. To argue that trans women simply reaffirm a stereotypically feminine model is to see all trans women as a homogeneous group, feminine, heterosexual, and wanting to transition. It ignores the fact that cis and trans women adopt stereotypical femininity for the same reason, blaming them for the gender scripts necessary for survival. In many cases, trans women may be actively encouraged by doctors and gender identity clinics to adopt conventional femininity as a means of proving that they are who they say they are. This proof would not be necessary in a different world. These kinds of requirements have far less to do with individuals and more to do with the way rigid ideas about gender are currently embedded in our social lives. The aim, at very least, is to destroy that rigidity. So Lola Olufemi's book and a lot of the writings against TERFs or that are in support of transgender rights are really nice, and they're really beautifully written pieces of human rights legislation. One could also argue, though, that the refusal to accept transgender rights and transgender people involves a refusal to compete as a capitalist. So, in the worlds of, say, fashion, in the worlds of film and art and design, many people would like to buy things, and they are not only white Christian housewives or white Christian cisgender heterosexual women of a certain age. So perhaps in order to support capitalist growth and development, we need to support a diversity of interests in the marketplace. And so Canada has adopted, yes, Bill C-16, which will support transgender rights. And some of our most successful artists and our most successful fashion designers and our most active consumers are queer and transgender people. So our economy will hopefully grow. So trans exclusionary radical feminists have not only created a false dichotomy between cisgender and transgender women, they have managed to distract our attention away from the structures that determine the conditions of our lives, and most importantly, ensure that all women are not free. We are all implicated in the violence against trans people when we allow their lives and the harm they face to be diminished by a media circus, or when we enable TERFs to set the feminist narrative. As feminists, we have a duty to dismantle that circus and redirect the public imagination. Trans life is fundamental to our collective liberation. So it is interesting again to think about the arguments that can be made against different forms of what I would term fascism. So gender fascism, or kind of cis-normative forms of fascism, could be argued against from this perspective of human rights. And like all cases of extremism or extreme kind of violence against minorities or one's right to express themselves using, say, religious symbols or makeup that you want to wear, clothes that you want to wear, the argument could be that this is a human rights violation. And often the argument that people make against fascism is from the left wing and is a human rights argument. The argument that one could also make against fascism is an argument that capitalists would always make, that the capitalists would make, that if someone wants to buy certain things or sell their labor, they have the right to do so. So if the best model is a transgender person, or if the best worker or the best student, if the best and most interesting book is about transgender rights and sells a whole series of copies, then yes, people have the right to sell and to buy, irrespective of who forms the majority and who forms the majority religion, or what people who decide themselves to be part of a majority look like. I mean, this idea that one is even part of a majority is really questionable in multicultural Canada. Many people often say Canada is, I don't know, a country where people are Christian or white. And from a sociological perspective, one would have to look at recent statistics in certain cities to really determine who forms the majority. The rates of divorce, for example, are not easy to track. People get divorced every minute or every hour in certain cities and certain places, and so it would be difficult to say that we are all part of a cis-normative family, or that is a norm. So I'll finish with this quote written by Judith Butler: "To operate within the matrix of power is not the same as to replicate uncritically relations of domination." So that is all. I have not marked all. Oh, I should say I have not marked your tests yet. I've not marked all of your tests. Therefore, I have not released the grades. I am sorry for the delay. I know that any of you are keen to see your grades, I will release the grades next week. So I know some of you emailed me because you saw a 0 and you did submit your essay, but I haven't marked the test yet. So that is why you haven't seen your grades. You haven't received a 0. I just haven't marked it yet. And because it's on Blackboard, it shows up as 0. So sorry about that. I hope I didn't cause any anxiety. I just haven't marked everyone's test yet. So I will submit your grades hopefully by next week. Any other questions? I do think Canada is a really interesting country, and when you go anywhere else to talk to people, I did my postdoc. My PhD was at York University in Toronto, and it was in sociology, and you can get full funding to do a PhD from SSHRC. Firstly, from OGS at the master's level, you can get an Ontario Graduate Scholarship to do a master's. Then you can get funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to a PhD. And you can also then do a postdoc, which can be funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is a federal government institution, which gave me money to do a postdoc at the Open University in London, England. And when you travel internationally, a lot of people do talk about Canada as being a leader in human rights, particularly because of our legislation regarding trans people and regarding queer rights. So I think that Canada has the capacity to be a leader in human rights because of our comprehensive legislation. And I think that the way that this can happen is if we actually institute a culture of legality. So irrespective of what someone's family is like or what someone's friends or social circle is like or what you look like, Canada is a country of laws. And so even though someone might not resemble your parents or you might have your own chosen group of friends, this does not affect our laws at a federal level. And if someone violates our laws or supports a culture of illegality, then I think that we have to uphold our laws. So there is a test on the 13th, which is next Thursday, and it will be the same format. So I will post the questions online, and it will be the same. Yeah, it will be the same format. It's just, I guess, things like transphobia or gender identity or things that you could think about. The Robert Brim book, like chapter on poverty, involves a lot of terms about poverty that I think are of interest. If you're interested in going to law school in Canada or doing a master's degree or doing a social work degree in Canada, then I think a lot of the terms would be of interest because he does write a lot about poverty and laws in Canada and the gender pay equity gap in Canada. So hopefully the test allows you to think about the concepts, and hopefully learning these concepts will be useful in your future career. If you get, say, a college degree or diploma and you get a job afterwards working for any of Canada's institutions, then I think the terms from the Brim book and from our lecture will be useful. Like learning about Bill C-16 is really useful when you work in Canada because it allows one to perform one's duties with respect to the law and politely in relation to everyone one encounters. And so it's good, I think, to learn these things before one starts to work or while one is working in Canada. I there any other questions? Okay, thanks a lot. I'll finish the class there. I'll talk more about the second test on Tuesday when we meet. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you for your participation. Bye. Thank you.